Hello all, we are gathered here today in order to witness the union of doodling and watercolor together as one. I will be going through lots of detail on supplies within the video, but don't worry, basic supplies for today's project. Some nice thick paper, preferably watercolor paper, a marker of some type that is not going to bleed, so like a fine point Sharpie or a black permanent marker, and then if you're really feeling jazzy, you can throw in some gel pens. And finally, some watercolor, all right? That's all you need to get started for today's video. I hope you are ready to enjoy these glorious pieces of watercolor and doodle that you'll be able to make all on your own and make some beautiful art. So let's make art together. Let's get started with today's project. Now, I will say this project can take only 15 minutes, it can take 30 minutes, it can take over an hour. It depends on how you want to approach it, and you'll see what I'm talking about in just a second. Really quick, I wanted to make sure for you visual learners, if you're like me and you need a visual, I want to make sure I go over supplies. So, in the beginning, I told you watercolor, some sort of permanent marker, a gel pen if you want to, or some gel pens, and then you'll need watercolor, okay? I'm just gonna go over really quick what those look like. So when you get watercolor paper, you're gonna have options and it might be overwhelming. Honestly, just go with whichever one you want to try out, okay? Sometimes you'll find like student lines of watercolor. Strathmore's a really good brand. They'll come in different sizes and shapes. That's totally fine. Just find something that you feel like you're comfortable with, but it's got to be a nice thick paper because we're going to be putting quite a bit of water on here for this project, and you want it to be a paper that's meant for that. So copy paper, cardstock, definitely not good for this. So this watercolor paper is great. I'm actually going to be using a sheet of this today. Mixed media paper. This is a paper that is actually appropriate for many different things. And a lot of times these paper pads will tell you what you can actually use on the papers. So for this one, you can use acrylic, watercolor, and pen and pencil. So if you are looking for papers to get and you're trying to do all sorts of different art techniques, this mixed media paper is the best because you can get all sorts of different supplies and you can use it in just this one book. And you don't have to keep it all in the book. These are perforated, so you can actually just, you know, kind of pull a sheet out of there. Maybe you're doing acrylic one day, maybe you're doing some pencil one day. So highly suggest the Canson mixed media paper. Now, Canson also has this really great, super sturdy watercolor paper. When I used to be a teacher, this is the watercolor paper I would get for my students because they were beginners. And oftentimes with watercolor, the water tends to be a little bit too much. So sometimes you accidentally add too much water and your paper starts to tear. So some watercolor papers are a little thinner, some are a little bit thicker, okay? I'm not even going to get into the different paper types on here yet. Some people will be like, it's too much info. So I'm just gonna let you know that this Canson watercolor paper is great. The only thing I will let you know is that cold press versus hot press, a cold press paper will have a little bit of texture to it. A hot press paper will feel super smooth. So if you see that, just kind of have that in the back of your mind. Next, we have your watercolor. I know this one looks a little dingy, but that's because it is well loved and it's one that I use quite a bit. Pan watercolor is a great option. If you get pans like this, you can find them easily at Michael's. You can find them online. I love getting the ones like this because you can take the top of the pan off and it essentially will act as a palette. So if you want to like mix some colors, you don't have to do it in here. You can do it in the top of the palette. But I always like to pop them off because I usually just use it like this. So pan watercolor is a great option. I do have a watercolor class in a bag kit that I sell on my website. So if you want this plus some other watercolor supplies, this is available in that kit. And that's available on my website. You might also find tube watercolor that you see in the store or online. For this type of watercolor, you're definitely going to want to have a little palette that you're putting the color in, or even a paper plate, preferably one that's like coated because you're going to be adding water to it, or for using a foam plate. You can sometimes use the lid of like an old yogurt container. You just want it to be a surface where you can squeeze out a little bit of this paint and still be able to add water to it. Last, we have this watercolor. This is a special case watercolor, but I wanted to show you this because in some stores they will sell watercolor like this in a dropper form. So it's not always in a big container like this. Sometimes you can find maybe like 2 or 3 colors you really like and you buy those in the bottle, and that's totally fine, especially if you're experimenting. This particular set I bought directly from the Dr. P.H. Martin's website. These are usually $80. Now, before you think I'm like big ballin' and shot callin', I had a coupon because I got these at the height of the pandemic when they were trying to just get rid of the stock that they had because they weren't sure when they were going to open again. Everything was 50% off. So if you've heard me in any of my other videos, I love me a coupon for art supplies. I love me a sale on some art supplies. So that was the only way I was able to afford these. Sometimes you can find them in other places where they're a little less expensive. You don't have to get the super expensive ones, but I will tell you that the way the color goes on is going to be very different. These are super crazy pigmented. And so for today's project, we're going to be working on watercolor doodles. So see how you can basically hold this at any angle. We're going to be working on these little watercolor doodles. And if you look in here, you can see the watercolor looks kind of granulated. That's from using this watercolor. So today's is going to look a little bit different because it's not going to be as granular as this watercolor. It'll be a little bit smoother. But if you start getting to the point where you start testing different watercolor types, you're going to start to notice that there's going to be a difference in how it goes onto the paper. You'll also want some sort of doodling utensil, preferably something that's not going to bleed. So like any sort of permanent marker. And like I said, if you're feeling fancy, you can have some gel pens. A white gel pen is always super helpful, but if you've got other colors of gel pen, that will work perfect as well. So I've got all sorts of different pens in here, different brands of pens that I've tested out over the years that I like using for doodling. You don't need a full set like this. These are just ones that I've purchased for myself because I've actually used them on lots of different things. Paint marker is an option, but just know that the tip of the paint marker might be a little too thick for what we're doing. So something like this might be too thick because we want very different lines as we're doodling. We don't want all the lines to look the same. So something that's really fine point would be great. If you have a micron pen or a double-ended permanent marker like this, that's also a good choice. This has a super fine point on one end, and then it has basically kind of like a regular marker size on the other end. And then micron pens, you can get them in different sizes. Some might look more like this, and then others might look super fine point like these pens here. So basically, if you want to start off small, I strongly suggest the ultra fine point Sharpie. And then to get like some different lines, if you don't want to use this to make everything look a little more bold, then the fine point Sharpie. So these together are perfect. I really like using this marker here, this dual tip marker that has a broad tip and the fine point tip, because with a chisel tip, you can really get lots of different line types and line thicknesses. And then it also has this fine point end on it too. And I also have these two markers together in my watercolor class in a bag. Something that is optional along with the pens would be the washi tape or painter's tape. Watercolor paper will curl when it starts to get wet. So if you want to hold it in place, these are highly suggested. If you just don't have it, maybe you just have some regular Scotch tape and you just kind of tape in the corners. It's not really advised because Scotch tape can tear your paper. But if it's all you've got, you really want to try this, that's fine. Highly suggest painter's tape if you've got like a larger paper, but oftentimes washi tape is just fine. And here we are, ready to get started. Of course, it should be self-explanatory if we're using watercolor. We are going to need brushes. So when it comes to the types of brushes you grab, if you grab one of those handy little packs they have at like Walmart or Michael's where it's a bunch of brushes all together, just make sure the pack says watercolor on there, that you can use it with watercolor, because some brushes might not work very well with the watercolor paint. And also you'll want a couple of different sizes. So I've got two that are similar in size. So these will be good because we're going to be making some puddles on our paper, and then a smaller size brush. So that's perfect for you. When it comes to water, it is a great idea to have two water cups because one can be for the super dirty water. The other cup can be for adding water, just super clean water. Because once you start adding color to one of these, it's going to mucky up the water. I actually made those two cups. I'm so proud of myself. Those are made out of clay. So this project is going to be all about seeing what happens when you add watercolor to puddles of water. So if you remember back on this example I showed earlier, we've got all sorts of funky little blobs happening. That's what we're doing on this. This is kind of like a low stakes type of watercolor assignment because we are not super worried about making it a landscape, making it look super realistic. You can have some realistic elements on there like, oh, I've got a flower and a leaf. Or you might go more organic blobby type things, okay? The one thing I want to make sure you are paying attention to is the one vocab word for today, and that is contrast, which is basically a difference between light and dark. Before anybody decides to get way too saucy with me, I just want you to know that I may have misspoke, and that was technically the definition of value. Contrast is going to be opposites, okay? So you got light versus dark, just like the definition on the screen, okay? Don't come at me. I was just really excited to teach you about doodles, okay? Okay, love you, bye. We're going back to the video. So when it comes to us adding our little doodles and adding our colors, we want to think about contrast. So we want some light colors, some dark colors. When we start doodling, we want some things that might be filled in, some things that are not filled in, okay? Just keep that in mind in the back of your head. Now, if you want to fill your entire page with color, and let's say you were going for something more like this, but it ends up going a little left and your whole page is covered in paint, don't worry, you can end up doing something more like this, okay? So this is another one, basically any angle you can decide what's top or what's gonna be the bottom. This was a painting I did where I completely messed up on the background. I was just testing some new watercolor I had and just kind of messing around on the page. And then I was like, ew, I don't wanna waste it. So then I ended up just getting a white gel pen and then just drawing some crazy doodles and lines on top. So this is an example of the project taking much longer than 10 or 15 minutes, okay? So you can take this as far as you want, or you can do it very loose and open like the first example that I showed. The very first step, we're gonna grab one of the larger brushes, okay? And we are going to be adding some blobs of water on our page. Now, we're not gonna cover the entire page. We are just gonna add some blobs here and there. Again, if you decide you want to use the painter's tape or the washi tape, I just stuck some in all four corners so my paper wouldn't move around. I just kind of tucked it under here so that way it kept things in place. So I'm just getting some water on my brush. My brush is over here off camera. And then I'm just gonna, with clean water, I'm just gonna add a little blob of water. And we do want it to be puddled up a little bit because we're gonna be relying on the water to help move the paint. So as soon as I finish that, I'm going to get my smaller brush and wet that, and then just pick a color with whatever type of watercolor you decide to use, and then we gently blot it into our puddle. So the goal here is to get the watercolor to move. So if you end up adding color like this and you're looking at it and you're like, it's either moving super slow or it just stays where it is, that means you just need to get your larger brush again and just add a little bit more water to help the colors travel a little bit more. So see how it's starting to break up the paint a little bit. You can even add some on top of what you've already put down. And so now it's moving and traveling, okay? That's what we want. That's how we got that effect on the example because it just kind of was able to travel around on the paper. Now, you don't have to do little dots. You can actually kind of take your brush and drift it across to kind of help it a little bit, get some explosions of color. And that kind of helps it along too. Now our goal is to still make it kind of open and wispy, so we don't want to make this whole thing be purple. We want to be able to still see some white through it, okay? So you're just going to travel along on your paper. Remember, this is why I said it's important to have 2 water cups, so that way you've got one that's the nice clear water, and then another one that's got your dirty water in it. All right, again, thinking about our vocabulary word we said earlier today, which was contrast. So I'm going to go with an orange color this time. Ooh, see how that one likes to spread a little bit more. I'm just kind of bouncing the brush. We don't want a specific pattern or anything. We just want to see what happens. And I'm working quick because the watercolor paper wants to absorb the water. So if you wait too long, your little puddle there for helping the color travel, it's going to be gone. You can still add more water to it, but then it won't get as nice of a cohesive spread. All right, so we're just gonna keep bopping around on this page. You can change the shape of your blobs as well. Now, one thing I want you to be aware of, if you put down a blob of the water, I was about to say watercolor. If you put down a blob of the water and you're like, oh no, I didn't want to do one right there, you're probably going to want to just completely avoid that area. You can blot it with a paper towel, but just kind of like leave it alone, because you'll want that to completely dry, but then just start working on another area. So let's say I put water here and I'm like, oh wait, no, I kind of wanted to leave that open. Just come work on like an opposite side, and it should be fine. Now, something else that might happen, you might be moving along and accidentally bump your brush into another section. Look what happens. You'll get some of the paint from the other one that starts oozing down into this one. Well, that's okay. We can just make that section like a different color. So maybe instead we want to try to get some pink in here. And just kind of add that in there instead. Now they might start to blend together. That's okay. But it's just something to think about while you're making your little blobs of color. So you can just go back in and maybe like fix it and add a different color. You can also add multiple colors into one. It doesn't have to just be that one color. So maybe inside this one, I want to brighten things up a bit and add a little yellow to it. Totally fine. We're still thinking about contrast, okay? Still adding our little blobs. We don't need to have too many. I just did the cardinal sin where I forgot to rinse my brush before I added it to the blue. Luckily, that was not added into the yellow, but sometimes that might happen when you start painting. So look how the color's just sitting. That might be where I'm like, oh no, I'm actually working in one of the dry areas instead of where the water was. Just kind of go back over it a little bit. Again, these are areas we're going to doodle into, so if you make a whoopsie, it's totally fine. Now, you might start looking at this and you're like, ah, man, I'm making all my little shapes look the same. Totally okay. Remember, we're going to be adding some doodles all over the paper. So if you decide that you're like, oh no, I've done, and you know, things look a little too much of the same, we can draw on top of these and around these and everything to make them look a little bit, you know, differentiated from one another. All right, let me get this green, and that's probably going to be my last little blobby that I add on there. So we're just kind of speed running our way through. Add more water if you need to. And there you go. So as you're looking at this, you might want to touch up some areas. You might want to add a little bit more pigment to some areas. Fix it up however you want to. Try to avoid using like super dark colors like black, because we're going to be using black Sharpie on here. So it's going to end up interfering with that. Now, if you do have the white gel pen, that can actually work to your advantage, because you can go in on top, if you did use, you know, the really dark colors, and then you can add in some of the gel pen on top of that, and that would work perfectly as well. So any of these, decide what other colors you want to put in, if you want to put other colors in there, and then you're going to have to let this sit and let it dry, okay? It's got to dry completely before we can put the color, or, well, it's not going to be color, it's going to be permanent marker that's black, but before we put the black marker on top. I do not suggest at this point trying to grab a blow dryer, because you can see there's still like a pretty large puddle of water and color right here. So you do have to kind of have some patience and just let it sit on the page, let it dry, and then we can come on back to it and we will start adding our doodles on top. Ta-da! Everything is nice and dry. I'm not gonna lie, I did hit it with the blow dryer. I thought everything was dry, but you can see there's some points where it kind of dragged out a little bit, but that's okay. It gets super annoying if it just streaks across your whole page and you don't want it to, or maybe that's your vibe and you want to see what happens. I will do that on some of my acrylic paintings, and it's kind of fun when it's planned. But if you decide that you want to use blow dryer, do you, test it out, try it out. It does really help with watercolor though, when you're doing these abstract pieces and you just want to get stuff dry. So next thing we're going to do is adding our lovely doodles to our page. Again, you can decide if you want to do something that looks a little bit more like something you'd see in the real world. So I've got like the flower and the leaf up here. So if you're looking at something on your watercolor page right now and you're like, oh, that reminds me of a flower, then by all means, draw it like it's a flower. You can also pull up some online images if you need to, if you want to maybe look at different animals, and maybe you see something on your page that reminds you of an animal. Maybe it looks like a jellyfish, maybe it looks like an elephant, whatever, go with it, okay? This project is for you. It is not something that we're trying to enter into an art contest, okay? It's just you kind of playing around, testing things out. If you're not sure what type of doodles to put on your page, I strongly suggest looking for books like this. So these two books I found at Half Price Books. You can probably find them at Amazon or, you know, local bookstore. But they basically have tons of different patterns in them. So if you're trying to come up with a pattern, they've got super simple ones, and then they've got ones that are super intricate too, okay? So that just gives you some really good ideas. I use these a lot in my doodling practice, just because it's nice to have something to just look at and reference instead of feeling like you got to pull everything out of your head and maybe you've had a stressful day and you don't know what you want to draw. So these are really helpful with that. So if you are someone who's very apprehensive about creating art, and even this project on its own is freaking you out, I strongly suggest this book here by Dean Nimmer, Art from Intuition. So this book basically has tons of different exercises to help you out, to kind of get you out of your comfort zone and to make you just start making some art, okay? Things don't have to look super perfect. You can make things look super funky. I love referencing this book because it really does do a good job of just laying out some exercises for you to do, so that way you can kind of loosen up and not get so stressed out about making art. So let us move on and start making some doodles. I'm going to be using my super fine point Sharpie, my double-ended marker, permanent marker, And I got a gel pen, just in case I'm feeling sassy, okay? So, if you'll notice, we've got all sorts of different lines and shapes on here. We talked about earlier about contrast. So, I am going to probably start with the superfine point, just so I can see what types of things I want to add on here. Now, we don't have to draw on top of all of these. We can leave some of these alone if we wanted to. You might decide you want to do kind of like a ribbon kind of that cuts through. I love doing that because it kind of makes your eye go through. This is like an old gold metallic marker I had forever ago. I don't even remember the brand of the pen. But maybe that's something you do want to do. I'm going to avoid using any pencil on here. We're just going to go straight up with the Sharpie. Just dive in and have at it, okay? So maybe in one of these you want to go with, let's do like curved lines. Now, this is also why I say to use a permanent marker. Because if your paper is maybe like slightly damp, it shouldn't bleed and mess up the marker. If you were using like a marker or pen that was water-based, well then it's going to grab onto that water and continue to travel. So I'm just going right on top and adding some lines. So this drawing has no plan whatsoever. We're just kind of winging it because that's what doodling is. You're just going to wing it and see what happens. So we're going to look at these other shapes and decide if they look like something, if we want to try to make them look like something, or if you're like, I just want to straight up doodle in them. Or maybe you decide you don't even want to draw on top of these and you just want to maybe doodle in the background. Do that, okay? So we're just kind of messing around on here, okay? Let's see. I'm looking over at my little 2 drawings. I'm kind of looking off to these, and I'm just looking at some of the different patterns I've already done on other drawings and just trying to get ideas on what I think I want to do on this particular drawing. And you do not have to start on one area and, you know, work in any sort of order. You decide how you want it to go. Again, you might decide you don't even want to draw inside of all of these, and that's totally fine. That's up to you. You can kind of change up your pen strokes here. So see, I'm kind of starting off with like a wider little doodle and kind of making it a little close together. And you don't have to like speed run through this. If you want to take your time on this, take your time on this. If you want to, you know, outline all these shapes, which I might end up doing, you can do that as well. So we're just doing really simple little doodles right now. Nothing too complicated. I'm just going with a zigzag over here. I know it's kind of hard to see for a sec. So I got 4 little blobbies over here doodled inside of those. Now, I think I do want to add some sort of element that will travel throughout the whole doodle, just to give your eye somewhere to go. And I think I'm going to do that, because again, contrast. I think I'm going to do that with this fine point. All right, so that is my traveling element that goes through here. Again, we might decide that we want to go and maybe start tracing around some of these little blobbies, especially where the little stripes there are running into them. So I think I'm going to trace around this one a little bit. Ooh, you know what? Let's use... I'm going to use the thick. I'm going to use the chisel tip. right, so that is our little chunk there that we have outlined. You might decide, you're like, I kind of like how that looks. I might do that with all of them. Well, go for it then. I think I'm going to kind of alternate which ones are going to have the harsh outline and which ones aren't. So that way I don't have so many thick lines everywhere. Also, this little blobby here, remember how this was where the two kind of bumped into each other? If you want to keep it like that, you can, or if maybe you end up making this one kind of be its own thing, you can do that too. So just decide what you feel like is best on your own paper, okay? We can always turn these into like a little doodle area over here. But as you're working on your page, just, think about contrast, how you can spread things out, and what other little doodles you can add on here. So I'm just going to keep on trucking on this and just adding some different lines to it, and we'll see how it ends up turning out. All right, so I went ahead and split up this little blobby here into two. If that's not something you want to do and you want to keep it as is, then like I said, go for it. But you're just going to continue across this whole page. I think in the background, I might use this tiny one here, the ultra fine Sharpie. Maybe just add some little doodles like this, kind of look like little asterisks. Kind of try to space them out a little bit more. I started going in a line earlier and I was like, no, don't make them cluster up. We want them to look random. And I'm not going to do it across the whole thing. I'm just going to kind of do it in this one section here. Starting to look a little Blair Witch there with some of the asterisks. But see, I'm not trying to make these look perfect. They're doodles. Just, have fun with it. So I think what I want to do on this one is to have more things that are off in the white area in the background, like doing some, really bold, simple doodles here. And then continuing in the background with some smaller, more simplistic doodles. And we'll see how that looks. Again, if it doesn't look perfect, that's fine. A lot of this is just exploring and just seeing how it turns out. All right, so I'm going to keep on trucking with this, and then I'm going to show you what it looks like in the end. And there you have it. Mine is all finished. Now, I was going to come on here and, point out some things, but then the UPS man showed up, and then the dog started barking, even though it says on my door, do not knock or ring the doorbell, but they rang the doorbell anyway. The dog started going crazy. It turned into a whole thing, okay? But what I will tell you is that this whole thing is done with just really simple lines, okay? Now, something that will help you out that I did here, if you're kind of running out of ideas, you can use like some curved lines, any type of line. It could be a straight line too. But if you change how close they are together, like sometimes they're spaced out, over here they're spaced a little close together, and you kind of have that throughout, it adds more variety in your image. And I'm still using the same type of line. It's still a curved line. I just have some of them curved in different directions, and some lines are closer together than others. So if you run out of ideas, that is a good rule of thumb. Just start practicing putting some lines closer together and some farther apart. And I did the same thing with my pattern. So see how in some areas we've got just some little simple shapes and little dots here that are spread apart, but then you've got some areas where things are bunched up together. So again, thinking about contrast, areas that look like they're a lot darker, lines that are thicker versus areas that are a lot lighter, and lines that are a little more narrow. All right? So there you have it. There are so many different ways to combine watercolor and doodling. So I really hope you attempt this project and that you try it out. If you do and you're someone who enjoys Instagram, you can always, post a picture of it and tag me in it. So that way I can see it. My Instagram is in the description below. Also, if you do decide that you want to get some of this pan watercolor along with these two markers here, I've also got some watercolor pens that are in that kit. If you want to get that watercolor class in a bag, I do have that on my website. It's got watercolor paper in there to help you get started out as well. Everything you need to start with your watercolor journey, and even these pens. So if you got that kit, you'd be able to do this entire assignment all on your own. So links are down in the description. Thank you so much for stopping by my channel today, and I will see you in the next one.